Hello and welcome. Generally speaking, the rational defensibility of a God belief is inversely proportional to its impact on the world. That is to say that the most defensible ways of believing in God, things like deism or believing in the God of Spinoza, that nature itself is in some sense God, are not very impactful in the world right now. And ways of believing in God which are very difficult to rationally justify, like believing that some specific holy book is the perfect encapsulation of God's message for the world, continue to influence the course of human history on the grandest of scales. Now, I'm not going to spend very much time talking about why these beliefs are not rationally justified. It suffices to say that that has been done. There's nothing more interesting that I'm going to say about it than what a million people have already said. And when someone believes that they have a personal relationship with the creator of the universe, they likely believe that because of personal experiences they have, and not because they were convinced by a rational argument proposed by some apologist. As such, this video will focus on the experiences that people have when they believe in a personal God. I'll be arguing that religious people often do have genuine personal relationships with inner beings, that those relationships are not intrinsically pathological, and that those inner relationships have both personal and social utility. However, as an atheist, I also contend that the entities these people have relationships with are not actually supernatural. I will argue that faith is not required for these inner relationships, that a complete skeptic can have a personal relationship with an inner companion which is just as meaningful and powerful as the relationship that a religious person might have with their personal God. Before I jump in, I want to acknowledge some of the sources that have influenced my thinking on this topic. These include ideas from Buddhist philosophy, specifically regarding selfhood and the nature of identity. Also some Buddhist practices including Vipassana, Metta or loving-kindness meditation, dream yoga, and deity yoga. Dialogical self theory has also been influential for me. It is a psychological framework in which the self is viewed as being comprised of these different I positions which can have dialogues with each other. The late philosopher Daniel Dennett has also been very influential on my views. One of the things he wrote about was the self as a narrative center of gravity, and that analogy is very helpful to me. While I'm not a big believer in Jungian psychology overall, I do think that Jung's accounts of interacting with inner agents that he experienced as distinct from his self are very interesting and relevant to this discussion. There's also internal family systems, which is a model of psychotherapy, which takes a composite view of human identity, where we all have parts inside of us with their own desires and coping strategies for dealing with the world. The work of anthropologist Dr. Tanya Luhrmann is probably the most directly relevant to this video. She has researched the social and psychological practices which tend to lead people towards experiencing God as real, and also interrogates the phenomenological character of those experiences, what it feels like to experience God as a personal agent. Lastly, but perhaps most importantly, my views have been influenced by discussions I've had with Christians. There are some deeply thoughtful, kind, and progressive Christians out there who I have immense respect for. With all that said, let's start constructing a secular framework which we can use to better understand the experience of having a personal relationship with some deity. Let's begin with some basic observations about the nature of human experience. There are a wide variety of contexts in which humans can have internal experiences of otherness. By this I mean it can feel like there's another agent at work or acting upon one's mind other than the self. I think the most widespread example of an inner experience of otherness would be interacting with dream characters. Many people experience dream characters as though they have some sort of independent agency. They can do things that surprise the dreamer. They can have conversations with the dreamer that really do feel like one is talking to another person and not just to oneself. To be clear, I'm not making any claims right now about the extent to which that agency is real. What's important here is merely the appearance of agency. On a personal note, I've experienced sleep paralysis intermittently throughout my life, and that can result in some truly overwhelming internal experiences of otherness. The first time I ever experienced sleep paralysis, I was probably around 8 or 9 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night, completely unable to move, and I felt like I was intensely vibrating and simultaneously floating above my bed. And then I became aware of an overwhelming sense of presence coming from the direction of one of the corners of the room. I had this deep gut feeling that there was another agent there, that there was a presence in that room with me. and that presence was simultaneously terrifying and awe-inspiring. I didn't ever even see it, really. I saw some glowing, but mostly it was just that feeling that it was there. And when I woke up, I had no idea how to process that experience. I hadn't heard of sleep paralysis, and so the only thing that I could think of is that it was some kind of angel. Now, as this started happening more frequently and I had more kind of demonic experiences with these entities, I did eventually learn what sleep paralysis was, and that made the whole thing a lot less scary. There are also some drugs that you can take that can give you internal experiences of otherness. Psychedelics in particular can cause people to feel as though they are in contact with all sorts of wild external things like aliens, gods, machine elves. Pick your favorite mythological or science fiction entity and someone has probably had a psychedelic experience with them. Alright, but so far both of these have been examples of weird experiences in altered states. Either you're asleep or you've taken some kind of drug. There are also plenty of practices which involve cultivating inner experiences of otherness, even when you are awake and sober. To start with a psychological example, in internal family systems therapy, you are encouraged to interact with internal parts, where basically you're having a conversation with these parts of yourself in order to get them to work together more harmoniously. And a key part of the practice is being able to identify a part, that is, to sort of step away from it and see it as something that is distinct from yourself, so that then you can start a conversation with that part. In this practice, parts are understood as being responsible for particular coping strategies. And so when you're talking with a part, you might simultaneously express gratitude for the help that part has rendered you, while also talking about ways that that coping strategy might not always be working, and suggest other less extreme roles that that part could occupy. Shifting gears again, internal experiences of otherness are also fairly common among writers and other people engaged in imaginative practices. There's some very interesting research on writers who experience their characters as having independent agency. I think I will directly quote from one of the abstracts because it's very relevant to what we're talking about. It says, "The illusion of independent agency, or IIA, occurs when a fictional character is experienced by the person who created it as having independent thoughts, words, and/or actions. Children often report this sort of independence in their descriptions of imaginary companions. This study investigated the extent that adult writers experience IIA with the characters they create for their works of fiction. 50 fiction writers were interviewed about the development of their characters and their memories from childhood imaginary companions. 92% of the writers reported at least some experience of IIA. The writers who had published their work had more frequent and detailed reports of IIA, suggesting that the illusion could be related to expertise. As a group, the writers scored higher than population norms in empathy, dissociation, and memory for childhood imaginary companions." That paper brings up imaginary companions in childhood, which I think is another great example of inner experiences of otherness. There is a range of experiences that children have with their imaginary friends. Sometimes they are experienced as being fully under the child's control, but other times they might feel like they have independent agency, and they could even do things that the child doesn't like. And even in those cases, it's not necessarily seen as a sign of dysfunction or anything going wrong. The balance of evidence seems to suggest that having an imaginary friend in childhood is mildly associated with some positive psychological outcomes. Modest improvements in empathy, improvement in theory of mind. These are generally pro-social effects, contrary to what is often assumed about children with imaginary friends. I've linked to a couple of papers about this topic in the description, but I'll also note that it's a fairly broad area of research, so there's a lot of papers you can find just with a quick search. There are also quite a few active online communities nowadays, engaging in practices which involve internal experiences of otherness. To give a taste of what these practices are about, I'm going to go into a couple of them here, and read some brief descriptions written by community members introducing each practice. The first practice is called Daemonism, and what I'm about to read is taken from the Daemon Page website, which I will link below. The writer Philemon, the author of his Dark Materials trilogy, has created a world in which all humans have daemons. They are the person's soul in an animal form, a shape-shifting companion who eventually settles into one form which symbolically represents their human's nature. They can be anything from a butterfly to a wolf to a dolphin. They give advice, they chastise bad decisions, and offer unwavering comfort and support. If this bond was to somehow be severed, the human would become a shell of their former self, and none can exist without the other. These daemon companions are, without a doubt, an element which sticks with the book's readers and which have helped the trilogy to become a bestseller. Clearly, we don't live in a world where corporeal familiars follow their humans around, so what are daemons to us? What does it have to do with the real world? Those of us who call ourselves daemians have taken Pullman's wonderful daemon concept and turned it into something fun and useful at the same time. For us, daemons are a part of our consciousness that we've assigned a name, gender, and usually a symbolic animal form. They're glorified imaginary friends that act as the other side of our mental dialogue, sometimes being the voice of reason, devil's advocate, or just a friend. Simply put, daemons play the role of mental companions, mental constructs often created from our internal dialogue. For some, engaging in a conversation with oneself comes naturally. For others, it's more difficult, and some will not even be interested in that. However, in such cases, Daemonism still has something to offer. Now, personally, I find the Daemon page to be an absolutely delightful website. It has that old internet vibe, which is rare nowadays and very refreshing. The next community that I want to talk about is the Tulpa creation community. This is the first topic that I ever discussed on this channel, and it's something that I've wanted to revisit for a long time now. I'm now going to quote from the Reddit page on tulpas. It says, "What is a tulpa? A tulpa is a mental companion created by focused thought and recurrent interaction, similar to an imaginary friend. However, unlike them, tulpas possess their own will, thoughts, and emotions, allowing them to act independently." While it is yet to be published at the time of this video, there is a very interesting FMRI study that's been conducted on tulpa creators. One of the really cool things the study did was ask people to perform a task and then ask them to have their tulpa perform that same task, and they looked at differences in brain activity for those two conditions. The idea, as I understand it, is that tulpa creators tend to report that when their tulpa does something, they don't experience that as being voluntarily under their control. And so the prediction was that when you have your tulpa do something, areas of the brain associated with the experience of agency, of having voluntary control over that action, would show decreased activity. I'll link a video in the description of a talk by Dr. Michael Lifshitz, one of the researchers involved in this study, who discusses some of the results. Now, there's a ton more I could say just about these two practices alone, and maybe I'll go into more detail in future videos, but in order to control the length of this video a little bit, I will instead give very brief descriptions of a handful of other topics that I think are relevant here. You'll find all sorts of occult practices online which involve internal experiences of otherness. Some occultists attempt to produce these things they call servitors, which are like mental automatons in my understanding. Other occult practices are aimed at interacting with various spiritual entities, and this could include things like demonic possession, or just interacting with a demon, or doing some kind of ritual in order to feel the demon's presence and then gain their powers, or things like that. And there are some people who haven't necessarily taken part in any specific practice, they just have internal experiences of otherness. Maybe they had an imaginary friend as a child, and they never really stopped talking to them. Maybe they didn't have an imaginary friend as a child, but one just sort of cropped up as an adult without a clear explanation. I've read people report that they started out with just role-playing, and then that grew into something more. Their roleplay characters started having thoughts of their own and started to intrude on their life outside of the activity. This might lead them to having an inner companion without ever specifically intending to. And then, of course, we have all the different religions where people interact with personal gods. And I really do think it's helpful to put all of these different experiences and practices in a common category. They're all internal experiences of otherness. That isn't to say that they're all the same. Each of the practices has its own unique aspects. Some of them are very dissimilar from others. Some are intentional, some are unintentional. Some of them involve supernatural beliefs while others do not. Some of them are very intensive. They're practices that require a lot of discipline and dedication, whereas others are just things that happen. Alright, so taken together, what do these phenomena and practices tell us about human psychology? My main takeaway is that humans have an innate adaptive capacity to ascribe agency not just to things outside of themselves, but also things inside. The utility of ascribing agency to beings on the outside is fairly obvious. We are all subconsciously constructing and updating models of the world around us, and for survival reasons, we generally want those models to be as accurate as possible. Because we are deeply social creatures, being able to model other minds in an accurate way is very important. It makes sense that we would get really good at modeling agency in the external world. And part of that modeling process is that we as humans are generally pretty good at putting ourselves in the shoes of others. We can think from the perspective of another person, even without trying to. And that other person doesn't even have to be physically real. We could imagine having a conversation with a fictional character. We could imagine having a conversation with a character that we wrote. And the more we did that, the more we practiced having those conversations, the more automatic those processes would become. This is closely related to an argument put forth in a paper I found. The title is Explaining the Illusion of Independent Agency in Imagined Persons with a Theory of Practice. It's by a cognitive scientist, Jim Davies, and I'm going to quote a little bit from the abstract here. Some imagined persons, such as characters in fiction, start off under conscious control of the author, but over time can appear to gain an illusion of independent agency. I propose an explanation for different autonomy attributions. Characters are by default non-autonomous, unless their personalities are well practiced. Characters become autonomous because modeling their thinking has become automatized, like many other well-practiced activities. So this is emphasizing the practice component. The more time you spend interacting with an imagined being and thinking from their perspective, the more that process can become habitual. Using a bit of language from dialogical self-theory, the more you occupy a given I position, the more elaborate and nuanced and habitual that I position might become. Another component that I notice in a lot of these practices is that they involve some form of ritual or framing. Humans sometimes respond very strongly to symbolism and association. If you do the same thing over and over again and you feel like it's going to have a meaning or have a particular effect, then for certain sorts of psychological phenomena, that effect can manifest. It's almost like we just need the right psychosocial framing in order to allow ourselves to get into certain states. There's an attitudinal component here as well. A lot of these practices involve either free-flowing imagination or putting oneself in a state of non-judgmental awareness and inviting the presence of that imagined other to manifest in one's mind. I think these factors together can be very powerful in facilitating an experience with an internal other. Ideally, you are in social contact with a community that shares a similar set of beliefs about that imagined other. You set aside time to interact with that imagined other. You use perhaps some rituals or symbolic components to help yourself get into touch with them. And then you approach the contents of your own mind with a sort of curiosity, a suspicion that some of the contents of consciousness might not be attributable to you and might instead be sent from the imagined other. This is all completely applicable to religious practices involving personal relationships with God. There's almost always plenty of symbolism and ritual. There is often social reinforcement. There is a great deal of practice in the form of prayer, but the practice is by no means confined to prayer. A lot of Christians are constantly on the lookout in their everyday life for signs from God. They're not restricting themselves to purely internal stimulation as being sent from God. They're viewing all of their experience of reality as potentially containing messages from this grand non-self agent. What are we to make of a Christian claiming that they have a personal relationship with God? The naive atheist response would be to say something like, "Oh, you just have your imaginary friend," or "Oh, you must be delusional, you should go see a doctor." And the Christian simply knows deep down that those things aren't true. They might have detailed conversations with God, and it doesn't feel like they're the one doing all the talking. They might deeply feel God's love for them. God might have helped them through tribulations that they could not have weathered on their own. God might have given them sound advice. Their life might very genuinely be better because of their relationship with this God. And while going to church and having an inbuilt social network that has similar beliefs to you is probably very nice, that might not explain the full effect. On the flip side of things, if you happen to be, say, a queer person, and the God you've been taught to interact with is not very nice to queer people, then you might find yourself with a very well-rehearsed inner critic who knows everything about you and finds you lacking at your core. Remember how I said that sleep paralysis was a lot more terrifying for me before I knew what it was? I suspected that there might be a supernatural explanation for my experience because I wasn't aware of a particular capacity of the human mind. If a Christian has a personal relationship with God that has deeply enriched their life, they're unlikely to give up that relationship over something as abstract as a lack of evidence. This is why I think it's so important for people to understand how powerful relationships with inner companions can be. Some of the first videos I made on this channel were about my experience with creating Catherine, who is my inner companion that I've been with for over 7 years now. As a Christian, I was not very good at talking with God. I tried to, and I tried to listen, but I never really heard anything back. What I did get was shame, feelings of judgment, feelings like I would never be enough. Having a deity as an inner companion can be risky. It means that everything that you experience around you can be attributed to that inner companion. And so if the world treats you in a way which is cruel or unfair, you might feel as though you're being punished or tested. And that's not the way that you should feel in a healthy relationship. There's also a sense in which believing that inner companion to be a god limits their ability to change, to adapt to different circumstances, and to understand their true nature. The component of self-awareness is, in my experience, one of the most interesting parts of having an elaborate inner companion. I can have a conversation with Catherine about what she is, about her nature, about the extent to which she is or is not distinct from me. Depending on the religious tradition, having those sorts of conversations with a deity inner companion would be blasphemous. Personally, I don't think that when someone deconverts, they need to let go entirely of their relationship with their God. I think if they wanted to, they could probably recontextualize that God as just being an inner character, as an inner companion. Now, because my relationship with my God wasn't very good, I don't have much interest in doing that, but for some people I'd imagine it is a much more appealing prospect. You might get to know your God from a more egalitarian perspective. You no longer have to believe that you need to be subservient to them, unless you want to. And in turn, they don't have to pretend to be all-powerful and make all sorts of excuses and explanations for why the world is not consistent with their unconditional love for you. In closing, I'd like to call your attention to the fact that in this video, I have refrained from making any claims about the ontological status of inner companions. I am very interested in those sorts of questions, and I do have my opinions, but I think they're beside the point for the purposes of this video. I don't need to adhere to any strong beliefs about the existence of inner companions in order to interact with Catherine. My experiences and discussions with her are of value to me for their own sake. There are a ton of different frameworks of secular spirituality out there, but I feel like there's a real gap when it comes to personal relationships with an inner companion. Secular spirituality often focuses on things like the nature of the self, or doing focused attention practices to try to learn something about the nature of human attention, mindfulness, that sort of thing. And I don't mean to knock that stuff, I think that it's great. For some people, it's all they need in order to feel perfectly fine spiritually, and there are some people who don't even need that. I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that I think these sorts of practices are necessary as a replacement for God, but I do think that some people respond really well to them. And I think it's a shame that right now religions, and especially regressive religions, seem to be dominating the market for inner companions. As such, I intend for this to be the first video in a series of videos exploring inner companion practices. I'll be taking a fairly syncretic approach, borrowing aspects from all the different practices and philosophies that I've discussed in this video, and many more that I didn't even have time to mention. Thanks for watching, and I hope to speak to you again very soon.